Welcome to the Imagine Belfast Festival discussion on how to lose a referendum. I'm Mark Devenport and I'm joined by our panellists, Quintin Oliver, who was a campaigner in the Yes campaign on the Good Friday Agreement, Emma DeSouza, who's a citizenship rights campaigner and has been involved with the discussion about the potential future border poll here, and Aaron Callan, who works for the DUP in the office of the MP Gregory Campbell and has got a lot to say about the unionist perspective on all of these questions. You're all very welcome to this event. What I wanted to sort of cover in this discussion, if people are happy enough, is maybe some of the, if you like, ancillary and technical questions about referendums. There's absolutely no point us sitting here and debating whether there's going to be a United Ireland or a United Kingdom. It's been done so many times over, and that wasn't really the brief, I think, that was given in any case to the panellists. But what I think we can talk about is maybe some technical questions in relation to referenda, and also just general attitudes to referenda. I was looking at a recent article on Journal IE in which the author Eden Doyle was asking, I think in relation to the family and care referendum, have we reached the end of the age of Irish referendums? And I'm just wondering whether that could maybe be applied more generally, in as much as even the people who are in favour of Brexit are unhappy about how that turned out. Now we've got an Irish government that seems very concerned about getting its fingers burned, having been beaten in the family and care referenda. And also, of course, we didn't get Sinn Féin into government, so that has maybe somewhat slowed the kind of preparations towards any potential border poll. So do you think at the moment we're in a position, Aaron, where referenda are going out of fashion, certainly in this part of the world?
I think there's an element of that. I think there's a bit of referendum burnout, let's put it like that. I think because of particularly the Brexit referendum in the UK context, and that affected not just the UK, but obviously Ireland and the rest of Europe, and the conversation over the last several years since that referendum, I think has really created fatigue around referendums and what they actually mean and how they can be used and applied. And I think also, going back to the technical aspects of it, the way the Act was used during that referendum, I think, created a lot of mess as well. So I think that has maybe caused a lot of people to look at it again.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there was inconsistency in the Electoral Commission, and there was inconsistency in the way the campaign was shaped and developed. And I think that led to a lot of difficulties in the way it was carried out, maybe. And I think that's one of the challenges that we need to probably reflect as a democracy and as a society. What way should referendums going forward be used? And sometimes they can be used as a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Other times it can be used as a scalpel to carefully cut out a certain problem or deal with a certain problem. But I think that referendums generally, we do need to look at it as a society and decide how do we use them going forward as UK. Because in the British sense, in the British tradition, referendums are alien in many ways. Because I know during the Second World War, there was a discussion about a referendum about whether to keep the government going in a coalition. And Clement Attlee turned around and says no, he wasn't in favour of a referendum because it went against the traditions and values of British democracy. So it wasn't until early 73 the first referendum was held in UK context here. And I think that we, as a democracy, have never really properly thought through what referendums are supposed to be and how you use them.
Emma, do you think that for different reasons that maybe referendums have been going out of fashion? I mean, for instance, the new Irish government, which had pledged to have all sorts of referenda in relation to voting rights and so on, seems to have backed away from that now, maybe off the back of the previous government having lost in quick order a couple of referenda.
Yes, I'm particularly bitter about this presidential referendum because this was in the last programme for government. They had a commitment that they were going to hold a referendum on extending the franchise.
This was about extending the franchise to the diaspora, basically,
exactly,
and would have given a lot of people here in Northern Ireland potentially the vote. Yep.
Yeah, so to Irish citizens living outside the state, and now we're facing into a presidential election this year. I'm an Irish citizen. I live 5 miles from the border. Yet again, I won't be able to vote for my own president. My husband is American. He can cast his ballot. And here I am in the island of Ireland unable to vote in the presidential election. So I think it's a real problem in terms of Ireland's democracy and the fact that it is an outlier in terms of comparable countries. 125 enfranchised their citizens outside the state, so it's really not a controversial issue, but in Ireland is proving to be very difficult to get it off the ground.
Do you think that the reasons that it's maybe receded are because of the merits of that particular case, or is it that governments are now saying, hang on, don't want anything to do with referenda, thank you very much?
I think it's important to look at why referendums fail, right? So we know that maybe 1 and 2 might be successful, right? But a lot of referenda fail. We know that the reason for that is typically down to a lack of information for the public. So they don't necessarily know what it's for, a lack of relevancy for their lives. So what's the point in this constitutional change, this amendment? And then also rooted in a lack of engagement, right? So a lack of citizen engagement. If you're not mobilizing communities, you're not getting them involved in the conversation, then you're looking at potentially having a failed referendum. I think a good example of this around the lack of information one is the recent referenda that they had in Ireland with the care referendum. People didn't necessarily see the relevancy of it. They didn't understand the language. There was contention over whether or not it was the right language. It was different language from the Citizens' Assembly. It didn't mobilise communities the way the previous referendums had. And if you look at another example in Australia, the 2023 referendum on First Peoples, which was to recognise Indigenous people of Australia, that failed ultimately. And Australia is an interesting case study because they have mandatory compulsory voting, but they also require a double majority. So you have to have a majority of the population voting in a referendum, and you also have to have a majority within the states, a majority of states voting in a majority. So quite difficult. Only 8 out of 45 have passed on that basis. But the No campaign in that particular referendum was interesting because of how they addressed the fact that people didn't necessarily understand the question, didn't understand what they were being asked to change. And their slogan was, if you don't know, vote no, right? It's a pretty good example of effective campaigning. In the context of Ireland, I think that there's nervousness particularly around the presidential referendum because they're concerned that it will just ultimately result in a Sinn Féin presidency, and ultimately power and politics, a political party wants to keep themselves in power. But the recent examples demonstrate that the importance of being able to mobilise communities is something the Irish government has to work on. I think that point around, are we seeing a shift away from referenda? I don't think that's the case. I think that it's governments don't necessarily want to cede the power to the people, right? There's a sort of moving away from giving people an opportunity to have a say on changing the Constitution or giving people an opportunity to have their say in structures like citizens' assemblies. It's also notable there's no citizens' assemblies in the new programme for government. So I think the Irish government actually is moving a little bit away from empowering wider society to have their say, but I think society would still very much be in favour of using the tool of a referendum to be able to have their voice.
Quintin, obviously there are sort of precise reasons why Dublin's maybe backed away from the diaspora referendum, but if we're looking at reasons for governments to be reluctant about handing the decision over to the people in a more general international sense, I suppose they might look at a mixture of what's happened with social media, how opinion can be affected, that if at the time that you call a referendum, you don't know what the situation will be like when people are going to vote and whether they'll end up voting just because they hate the Prime Minister of the day or whatever. So there are potent reasons why a government might be wary about going for this.
Yeah, first point is risk management. And I think governments are much more conscious now of the risks. If half referendums are already lost and recent ones have been spectacularly different. Likewise in elections, the fact that the Starmer government can be elected by a landslide with 34% of the vote. The fact that Trump can be elected in what he claims is a landslide, but actually it was only a couple of percentage points in a wholly disproportionate system of the states where the electoral college is skewed. So Alaska and Hawaii and so on get 2 senators in the Senate when California and New York and Florida have so many more people. So there's a question of risk management and how do the political elites deal with that. Referendums, I think, will be very cautious because of social media, because of technology. It's such a risk that you won't get the result that you want. Ditto in elections, and I think that intensifies the question about what is our democracy and how do we get systems that restore confidence to people. Because it sounds simple, give a vote to the people, have a referendum, but underneath it, the complexities come out.
One technicality we were discussing actually before we began this meeting, Aaron, was what would be the role of the governments if we got to a border poll. Obviously, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, nobody had any doubt which side Tony Blair was on. He came over, he was signing the pledges. Now, I know that the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, many local politicians would say under the Good Friday Agreement, the British government should be sticking out of it, being neutral, no external impediment. But I imagine unionists wouldn't necessarily go along with that. What's your notion of what role the official governments, both the British and Irish governments, should play if we actually get to such a campaign?
Well, it can either go one of two ways, and I think that's going to be open to negotiation, obviously, in a political agreement at some point. You can either go to, well, there's actually three ways. You could go, what we talked about is that there could be interpretation that the British government stay neutral, the Irish government can campaign for. It could be that both governments stay neutral and let Northern Ireland decide, or it could be that both governments actually campaign for either side, and that could be that whoever the governing party in Britain at the time, it could be that, you know, if it was a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, it could do what he did during Brexit and disappear, not to tell anybody what way he's going to vote and let it go to the 4-1. So I think, given the sensitive nature of Northern Ireland and how it's governed, I think that would be very much something that would have to be carefully managed and agreed on, because you're quite right, unions are not going to be happy if it's decided that the Irish government can campaign for a united Ireland and the British government are just going to sit at the side. And I know previous Conservative governments have said no, they would personally campaign for Northern Ireland to stay within the United Kingdom. So I think that's going to be, and you're quite right, the Belfast Agreement is very silent on that. So I think that's going to be something that, when you look in light of referendums and what has happened in the past, they have to be carefully managed and agreed in the way that would work out.
Yeah, we didn't have some of the referendum rules that we've got now at the time. We had a referendum on the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, there'll be, obviously, from both sides, intense scrutiny on what role both governments play.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of negotiation required to create the structures and frameworks for how this is going to be run. Are they going to be run the same day? There's a debate around whether or not they have to be held concurrently in terms of North and South for a border poll, and then, of course, the role of the two governments. I know there's been some research done by University College Dublin looking at the context in terms of having it in the two jurisdictions. There's obviously the risk and concern of whether or not one jurisdiction might vote yes, one might vote no, and all the risks that come with that. But more broadly, there needs to be, I suppose, a framework created addressing some issues around who's the franchise, right? This is going to be an important one. So who's going to be able to vote in a border poll? Is there going to be an ability for people who are living outside of Ireland to return home to cast their ballot, or an ability for them to vote from abroad? A lot of people leave the island of Ireland to find better opportunities for a home or a university and all those places. And we saw big movements, the return to home vote in Ireland for equal marriage and for repealing the Eighth Amendment are really good examples of how Irish citizens living outside the state were really mobilised. You had people paying for other people's flights to get them home to be able to vote. So it's a question around the franchise. Obviously, another point on that would be lowering the voting age. I think would be also something to look at in advance of a border poll, and ensuring that those who are 16, 17 have an ability to have a say as well. It's their future. We might need to. But I think the role of the government is tricky, right? So it's quite clear the Irish government's going to campaign yes in a border poll. The challenge, of course, we have within society is the Irish government is apparently unwilling to do absolutely anything in advance of that. And I would imagine that, much like the Good Friday Agreement, it will be civic society that will ultimately pressure the governments and pressure the political parties to actually move the dial and advance this conversation. So it will be that external pressure first before the government will actually make any kind of movement. And then with the British government, I think, it is open to interpretation in terms of the role. I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if a UK government said we are going to support Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom. However, I think it's very unlikely, whether it's Labour or the Conservative Party, that they would have a very active role in campaigning for Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom. I think there's a lot of actual disinterest in Northern Ireland within both parties. And we can see time and again that often Northern Ireland is pretty far down the pecking pool of issues when it comes to our place within the United Kingdom. I think when it comes down to it, they might on the one level say, yes, we want Northern Ireland to remain in the UK, but I would not expect it to be a very strong campaign in support.
Aaron, do you agree?
I would disagree with that. I think, especially in the way, and we can't predict what's going to be like in 7 years' time. We can't predict what the world's going to be like in 6 months' time. But I think strategically, Northern Ireland is becoming more important to the United Kingdom and will be going forward. I know there was a paper done by Policy Exchange around this and looking at the threat that we're seeing from Russia and that has materialised into. And strategically, if you look at the importance of Northern Ireland to information going into the United Kingdom, the Atlantic cable that connects us to the world essentially and the rest of Europe as a world goes through Northern Ireland. So there's a lot of strategic importance to Northern Ireland. I think there's certain aspects of what Emma's saying in terms of what the United Kingdom looks at in terms of Northern Ireland, the government that is. Yes, there's certain aspects of there's managing it like a hot potato. But I do think at the heart of it, there's a lot of institutions and a lot of parts of the United Kingdom establishment that have a very important interest in Northern Ireland.
Quintin, obviously you were involved very heavily with the Yes campaign. If the rules that we now have in place had been in place back then, how different would that campaign have looked, do you think?
Very, because in '98 it was completely unregulated. There were no referendum rules. That didn't come to the PPERA Act of 2001. So it was unregulated. There was no campaign finance rules. We could raise as much money as we wanted and could. Now we declared it ahead of time. You know, I have to declare it, and there's always an argument as to who got what money in a referendum in the UK. So it was very different, and we had no social media. We just about had websites. We won an award for our website from a Belgian organisation. So totally different scenario, and that I think will make it interesting as to how it's formatted here. There's another conundrum in that the Good Friday Agreement says that the Secretary of State shall call a referendum if it appears to him, forgive the language, if it appears to him that a majority of people want to change the status and join Ireland. Now, if that's the case, if the Secretary of State decides, well, there is a majority now, how can they then campaign against it? So there's a logical inconsistency there. And it touches, as Aaron was raising, the famous Peter Brook speech that some of us will remember about no strategic interest. The UK has no strategic interest in strategic economic interest in the comma, whether that's important in Northern Ireland. But now, because of the change in the world order, there may be a strategic interest because of cables, because of army and defence and RAF issues, which means, do they change the Peter Brook statement? Actually, we do have a strategic interest and campaign, or do they change what? How do they position? And final point is boycott. Because if the Irish government is actioned, as it's not at the moment, as Emma says, to do more in preparation, with whom do they negotiate? Because if unionism says by negotiating we're bringing it on, therefore we'd better stay out of it, what happens if they continue to stay out? Does that mean it falls to the British government to negotiate on behalf of the people in Northern Ireland? And what credibility will that have? And would a boycott be sustainable, and would it screw the thing up? Or would they say, well, you had the chance, you didn't join, and people have now voted?
Emma?
I can pick up on that, because I think it's a good point around unionist participation in conversations around the eventual idea of a referenda, right? But a lot of unionists are engaged in the conversation already. And I think there's a real difference here. There's a difference between political unionism, right? So you can't expect politicians are going to go sit around a table and start creating plans of what United Ireland might look like. And that is 100% legitimate, because the Good Friday Agreement enshrines our right to have two different political aspirations. And I think it's wrong to expect that politicians who are clearly going to campaign to remain in the UK to help the other side in advance. I think that's not going to happen. But civic unionism is different. And civic unionism is already engaged in the conversation on what a new Ireland might look like. I was at an event not too long ago that was looking at women's participation in constitutional conversations, sat down at a table full of women, and it was a whole table of women from a loyalist group that had travelled for 2 hours to go to this event to talk about their role and what it might look like for them. So I think there's two different things there. There's the civic strand, where I do think that communities within the unionism community are already engaged and they will help inform the debate. And there's structures you can use. You could use a citizens' assembly structure, national dialogue structure, more civic spaces to create room for civic voice to rise up through that conversation, and then have that as a different strand to the political aspect of it. I don't think you can have everything created in advance before a referendum, but you can put a lot of flesh on the bones before.
This is something that's kind of come out of the Brexit referendum, that quite often when people are talking about a border poll now, they start saying, you've got to have all the nuts and bolts sorted out in advance, because in Brexit a decision was made kind of in a blind way. But I suppose you could knock that back and say, well, you're only going to give people one option. It will include, say, Stormont being preserved as a devolved part of Ireland, or whatever it will end up, that particular plan. And there might be people who might actually want to vote for a united Ireland, but might want to have the option then to decide all of that afterwards.
I think there's two bits here, right? So one, yes, we've got two quite clear examples of how to run a referendum and how not to run a referendum, right? We have the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, where there was a lot of detail put into the actual agreement in advance, and voters were given a copy of it. They were able to go through and address lots of really complex issues. And you have Brexit, one question that ended up being really divisive within society. So we obviously don't want the Brexit option in the event of a border poll. But I think there's a balance to be struck. There are big things that would have to be figured out in advance, right? So they would be things like the political institutions. Are they going to be sustained? Will Stormont still stay, et cetera, or is that going to be something that can be debated after? Healthcare is going to be one of the most important parts of this. People in Northern Ireland are really attached to the NHS, even though it is crippling, and many of us end up sitting for 14 to 18 hours in A&E, and there are serious problems with health provision. There's still a real romantic attachment to free at the point of access healthcare, and I think if you don't address that in advance, you're going to have a real challenge in winning a referendum. Economic issues, we know from Scottish independence that it came down to a lot of economic concerns, so you have to get ahead of those. But there are other things that are quite emotive that could be addressed afterwards. So take, for example, the issue around national symbols, right? It's quite an emotional topic. Often whenever I'm doing any talks, if the idea of changing the Irish flag comes up, it gets a very emotional response, right? But those are things that perhaps in an advance you could put into an agreement that in the event of a yes result, we will hold a citizens' assembly to make recommendations on changing the flag. In the event of a yes vote, we will enter into a transitionary period of 3 to 5 years for both the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Irish government to negotiate structures or change things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are some things you have to get done in advance, and if you don't answer those big questions around health, the economy, political institutions, are people's jobs going to still be there? Those need to be addressed in advance. But other stuff, because there's a lot that would have to be examined, can be done after, so long as there is a political agreement and people know what kind of structure would be in place for those issues to be addressed.
Aaron, I know that for some time there's been a debate within unionism when we're talking about what has to be done in advance as to whether to prepare or to say, look, we're not going there. For instance, there was, I think, a high-profile disagreement between Sammy Wilson and Peter Robinson, with Peter Robinson saying you should have an insurance policy. Essentially, you should prepare your arguments in advance, and Sammy Wilson saying, no, you shouldn't even contemplate that or go anywhere near that. Are we moving maybe more now towards the Peter Robinson approach? We see academics like Pete Sherlow going out and doing workshops and sort of getting the arguments prepared in advance. And is that a good thing or a bad thing from a unionist perspective?
I think having your arguments and soundings about why Northern Ireland is a good place and it should be in party like is good.
You're already formulating, for instance, a defence argument that you might not have formulated a year ago. So
yeah, and I think that's something that we should all be thinking about whenever you're thinking about a country, and it's in the context of the United Kingdom. I think unions should be willing and able to defend why we're part of the United Kingdom, and there's so many good aspects of Northern Ireland and why it has benefited from being in the United Kingdom. So I don't see a difficulty in doing that and developing that. And I think it has been something I would, one of the things, and I hear this constantly, that civic unions, and we're talking about United Ireland and talking about the prospect of United and what it would look like. I live among unions. I go to church every week. I go to different groups all the time. I was at a meeting last night in an Orange Hall. There's not one person I know from a unionist background is coming up to me and saying, we need to talk about what the United Ireland's going to look like. We need to talk about what a referendum, what we're going to get out of the referendum. What they're talking to me about is we need to be speaking up louder about what Northern Ireland is, how good it is, and why we should be part of the United Kingdom. So I think that, creating your arguments, marshalling your forces in terms of putting forward your best case and your best argument, because there is a changing ground in Northern Ireland over the last 20 years in particular. We're seeing the rise of that third tribe, as Lee Reynolds would term it. So you have those two blocks of unionism and nationalism, but there's also that other block who ascribe to a more Northern Irish identity and are more likely to vote for Alliance Party, for example. And a lot of them will probably be more open to that argument and discussion around the broader sense. But I've got to say, I don't feel a sense that there's this groundswell of civic unionism talking about a referendum or border poll at any point.
Now we're about halfway through the time that we've got allotted, so I'll just take a couple more comments from the panel and then we'll maybe go over to some questions. I mean, with your international perspective, Quintin, since working on the Good Friday Agreement, you worked on many referendums elsewhere around the world. Are you concerned about what the sort of recent shift in politics might mean for referendums? Because we've seen, obviously, a shift in Washington away from the old sort of rules-based order. And we all know about, say, the Vladimir Putin referendums in Ukraine. And we may, in the past, have said, well, that's what happens when you get Russia involved. But you could actually see a scenario. I mean, who is necessarily going to believe exactly what they read on the outcome, for instance, of any future poll on what the Greenland conducts, as to whether that has been conducted properly or not, and what influence has been brought to bear?
Yep, and it's mind-numbingly complex because of the politics of which we seem to be more aware now as to the problems and the gaming of it and how people will game it, like the North Macedonia referendum in 2018 that Alan and I were working on. Was boycotted by one side to get the turnout below the turnout threshold. But sometimes governments put in a turnout threshold, as they did in the first Scottish referendum in '79, 40% of voters, but that meant that you needed a huge turnout and a huge yes majority to get across it, so it can't be done. So North Macedonia, the no parties, boycotted it, got it below the threshold. So people are gaming it more cleverly and more strongly. And the point Emma made about how you will deal with some issues is key, because the Australian referendum on the monarchy, which everyone thought they were going to kick out the monarchy, but it wasn't clear as to what the substitute for a head of state was going to be. Would it be a nationwide election? Would it be in each state? Would there be vetoes from the states? Would it be a famous person, a politician, or a celeb? So if they had had a mechanism saying, if this passes, we will have a citizen assembly or whatever, might have helped for clarity. And the old days, it used to be simple. You do a pre-negotiation referendum, like de Klerk did. The last all-white referendum in South Africa in '92 was de Klerk covering his back with the white population, saying, can I go into negotiations with the ANC? And Mandela tacitly agreed that as the last all-white vote in order to deal with the spoilers in the white community. And Good Friday was post-negotiation, so we had the agreement, we knew the words, and that's thought to be good. Brexit was pre, although Cameron had negotiated some bits that January poorly. Scotland, you can argue, was sort of post-negotiation because the SNP had a prospectus, 600-page white paper, but they hadn't agreed it with the British government. Therefore, was it pre or post? So all these issues will come into play and makes it more complicated and more politically volatile.
What are the chances, do you think, that any future border poll might be subject to a unionist boycott?
I think they are higher than I would have said a few years ago, because I think the awareness will be greater, and the tension between what Aaron described, it's the debate not happening in my community, and what Emma's describing, I'm hearing the debate, is sort of unsolvable. You know, both are right and both are wrong. So that's going to intensify even more. And then that big political unionist decision, do we take part or not, will become more focused. And I think there'll be a higher chance of a knife-edge debate within unionism. Do we go in and get the best of a bad deal, or do we stay out and hope the whole thing will just run into the sand?
Leslie.
Just say, I mean, just one example that falls a little between all stools actually was a referendum that Strathclyde region held in, I think, 1998, which is the reason Scotland has publicly owned water. Thatcher wanted to privatise, she did privatise everywhere else, and Strathclyde region decided to do a referendum of its people. Strathclyde region was huge, it was about a third of the population of Scotland, and got a huge turnout, 92% turnout, and something like a 96% no to privatisation. So even Maggie couldn't actually go, oh, but never mind. So actually there's a long story after it, but that is the reason that Scotland basically still has publicly owned water, was those guys just throwing that spanner in the works. So, you know, there's that utility to a referendum. But the question I wanted to ask really was, okay, I'm a supporter of Scottish independence. Let's just put it out there. How can a country become independent if it isn't going to have a referendum? Because traditionally, if you look at all the countries that have become independent, you know, whether it's Finland, Norway, Iceland, you know, the ones that have become independent around us basically over the last 100 years, they've all had referendums to be recognised by the world community as legitimately independent. Because if you don't, then it just looks like, you know, we got up one morning, decided to be independent. So I hear all the problems there are, and it does raise questions, because I wonder, I think all of those, they were all 90 to 94% yes. It wouldn't have changed if it had been social media or anything then, probably for them. So it's more complicated now for sure, and yet in recognition terms, nothing's changed.
Maybe, I mean, there are, of course, places that are not recognised as countries. I was thinking, Somaliland? I don't know if they've ever held a vote
Turkish
there.
North Cyprus.
Turkish North Cyprus, yeah, the Kurdish regions as well.
Yes. And that I think is a fundamentally great question. You know, what are the international rules? Because it was fairly obvious when the Soviet Union fell apart, you know, that the Eastern European, Central European countries would vote for independence. They still had to do the process in order to prove it. Ditto South Sudan, which was the last world secession in 2011, who voted by 99% to separate from Sudan. So the question is not settled internationally. What are the rules? And there are some informal/illegal referendums, Catalonia 2016, Kurdistan 2016, where the people in those places held the referendum, but their parent state or states said, well, tough, you know, that's illegal. In Catalonia, they went brutally to root them out and take them to prison. In Kurdistan, they just ignored it because the question in Kurdistan was absurd. You know, it was, do you want Kurdistan, which is a defined area of Iraq, and all the other Kurds around to have independence? You know, which was a pretty silly thing to say in international terms, you know, that we will create a new state of people who want to be in us.
They should have been Humite and said that identity and territory is not necessarily the same thing. I
take the Scottish point. How do we get independence if you, the parent state, will not allow us a referendum?
Well, we go back to Western Australia. You set up a working committee, yes, to make it all go away.
Or a royal commission.
I think the challenge around Scotland is, unlike us, there's no direct, you know, route to potentially holding a referendum, and I think there's a bit of a warning in the Scottish referendum in terms of how it was done, and part of that is that independence was so clearly framed around one party, and the SNP has had a lot of problems since then. I think that's a big risk in any potential referendum. If a referendum is too closely aligned to one party, we see whenever there's bipartisan support, they're much more likely to succeed. and obviously civic society being mobilised is better as well in terms of having that engagement. So I think that's part of the challenge for any future referendum in Scotland, is being able to build that case from the society up to be able to put pressure on the UK government to have another referendum. And I think that's challenging in the current context with it being so closely aligned with one party.
And I know you've had some involvement with Ireland's Future, which is kind of trying to create this sort of sense of a broad umbrella movement and a sort of an inevitability about the process. But I mean, coming back to where we started in terms of the reluctance, you could say, well, you know, they did put out, I think, a publication just before the last election saying 2030 is going to be the date for the vote. But then those of us who've been around a bit will know that people were talking about 2016 as the target date, and then 2021, and now it's 2030. So is it a bit of a moving feast?
I think putting a date on it is not really achievable. It doesn't help sharpen minds. And I do think that there's been a significant shift in this conversation, in this debate, since the 2016 Brexit referendum. But actually, it's still very surface level, right? There's very little detail. No political party has created a real vision of what this might look like. Ireland's Future does do really good work, but it also still maybe is a little bit, you know, surface level. It's not getting into the real meat of what would an all-Ireland education system look like, not having really good, fierce debates about the merits of the two systems and how we might change them. So I think at the moment there is a limitation in terms of what's being actually actioned on the pro-United Ireland side, as well as the pro-Union side. There are groups like Uniting UK, Together UK, that are mobilising people within Unionist community, and I think ultimately those two actually probably will emerge as pro-UK campaigning groups in the event of any border poll. But wider society has to become engaged. I don't favour using an all-Ireland Citizens' Assembly, which I know Sinn Féin speaks about quite a lot, as a tool for trying to design a united Ireland. I think what Ireland actually needs is a national dialogue, which is closer to the Colombian model, where you're trying to do a much more expansive examination, where you're trying to really get society engaged, you're trying to reach people who aren't normally in a community group or aren't part of a civic society organisation or are political activists, just regular people to engage. And I think that you need to take a much more expansive approach. Civic society could do that. A project I just worked in, the Civic Initiative, we did our own Citizens' Assembly here in Northern Ireland because politicians weren't going to do it for us, and we mobilised a lot of wider society around a debate around housing. But it's about trying to get civic society to step up and take that work forward in a much more proactive way. And civic society is underfunded, overstretched, and has been, I think, a little bit tempered since the Good Friday Agreement, isn't as keen to challenge or push because of the political climate. So still waiting for the two camps to emerge in a much more effective way. And I think we will see that over the coming years in the absence of the governments doing anything.
Aaron, I know you'd be resistant to the notion that there's any inevitability about this at all, but maybe sort of bringing in what Leslie was saying about that you do need a referendum in order to provide any kind of legitimacy to either independence or change of this kind. And also what I was discussing with Quintin about the possibility of a boycott. I mean, do you think the Unionist community will recognise the legitimacy of any kind of exercise that happens, or might they be tempted to just say, no, we're going to stand outside it?
That's a big what-if question there, yeah. But what I would say about referendums, not inherently good or bad in their entirety. How we manage the process is a political question, ultimately. You know, if you go to the Scottish referendum question, whenever that was negotiated and agreed, and Emma's quite right, it was a political party drove that, was the SNP. I didn't sense that there was a wide civic society of Scotland saying, we want a referendum. It was really to a political agreement between the SNP and the British government, essentially. And the agreement that they undertook was this would be a generational referendum. And this is where the fallout of referendums come into play. So, you know, if you look at the Belfast Agreement, you know, it's very short in what it says about a referendum, and then there's a section where it says one can be held no earlier than 7 years after holding the previous poll. If you look at the Scottish referendum example, the SNP are at fault. If you're talking that the referendum, there's not a follow-up referendum. The problem is there's getting the political agreement then to get a follow-up. And the referendum, that's why I said at the start, referendum sometimes can be a sledgehammer to solve a problem when it doesn't need to be. And I think they're far better told than what ultimately could be a war, for example. that a country can be created out of, and you're far better having that political dialogue and discussion. But that's where the fallout of a referendum plays out, and we've seen that in Brexit, and we've seen it in the Scottish referendum, and a referendum doesn't end the question in either way. So even if you win the referendum, it doesn't end the question either. And that's the problem with a lot of these questions, like Pandora's box. Once you open it, you never close it back in. Just on the points around how we look at the future of whatever a border poll here would look like, I think it is going to come down to making sure there's proper a thought-out methodology about the way we're going to do it. And I think the point Quintin made about the Act, I think that's the point I was making originally. I think the Act that governs this, the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act 2000, is a bit messy in covering referendums itself. And I think that's where, as a whole,
What
of
changes
democracy
would
go
you
back.
want to see, ideally?
Well, there's a lot needs to. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from Brexit. There was a report done by Parliament, had a select committee, looked at Brexit referendum, and the lessons could be learned from that and how we can better manage it. Comes down to having the right information. Comes down, because even on both sides of that campaign on Brexit, there was false information given out. You know, every time Remain put out a statement, the cost of leaving went up, for example. Leave, there was statements they put out that was challenged all the time as well. So having how you have that campaign properly structured, properly thought out, properly financed, and it comes down to, and I know the segment was called "How to Win a Referendum." You know, referendum,
How to lose a referendum,
or how to lose a referendum. Sorry, you know, it comes down to three things. I essentially think, which is one, the hearts and mind. You have to appeal to the heart as much as the head. And if you look at the Remain campaign during Brexit, for example, it appealed to the head, didn't appeal to the heart too much. It's the same with having a positive message. I don't think, if you look at the Brexit campaign, Remain didn't overall have a very positive message. Goes back to what Quintin said about, you know, David Cameron negotiated.
Have a slogan of 4 words or less.
Well, it's not about slogan, it's about having that consistent positive message. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, the Scottish referendum, for example.
But this isn't what happened. I mean,
Yeah,
in the
but-
Scottish referendum, Project Fear just put out loads of stuff
Well,
about
what I would say
pensions.
about the Scottish
you know.
referendum is Gordon Brown kind of saved the Scottish referendum in many ways. David Cameron nearly crashed the referendum into the ground because there was a terrible campaign fought on terms of staying in the United Kingdom. It was a shocking campaign. Gordon Brown's speech saved that campaign because he was positive. If you look at his message, he appealed to the head and the heart. He was positive in his message, and he talked to the people
He was
rather than talking
Scottish.
at them. Yes, but the thing is, and this is my third point, he talked to the people rather than talking at them. And the lesson from Brexit and the Scottish referendum, when you look at how George Osborne and David Cameron ran those campaigns, they didn't appeal to the head and the heart. They didn't have a positive message, and they talked at the people rather than talking to them. And I think that is, in any referendum, those three components are essential to winning a referendum.
Can I just chuck one more wee question back to you on the basis of that and then just hand this over? But it's just as a wee clarification, at the moment, independents are sitting far higher than support for the SNP. And also, the SNP and the Greens are both pro-independence. And actually, annoying as it is to me to come here and realise that the Yes movement, which has worked continuously for 10 years, is invisible. It's the same for you guys in Scotland. We don't know about what you're doing in Civic Ireland here. So it's maddening because it's all voluntary, it's unfunded. The film that I had last night in Denmark is an attempt to say, here's a different kind of society. And that has been funded entirely by Yes supporters and has been shown around Scotland. It's had 1.4 million views on YouTube. So we're not sitting doing nothing. You know, there's quite a lot ongoing to have that dialogue of what kind of country you want, really. But of course, it's invisible from anywhere else because all you see is that Nicola Sturgeon's not standing again, which is annoying. Just the thing I wanted to ask you again is there is actually within Brexit and the Scottish referendum also 2 different ways to decide who could vote. So in Scotland, everyone was able to vote who had been there for 3 months before the vote. And actually, that both reflected a sort of Scottish attitude towards citizenship, which is generally, if you're here, you're here. Mm-hmm. And I mean, Sean Connery didn't get the vote because he was living on the Bahamas. To come to your point, Ireland's a different one because you're on the island of Ireland. So I'll give you that. I'll give you that. But the British referendum for Brexit had ethnicity at the heart of it. So basically, you had to be British, Commonwealth, or Irish. And it meant that people who'd lived in Britain friends of mine who'd been there for 40, 50 years, who were from Iceland or Norway or anywhere else, Poles, they didn't get to vote in the Brexit vote. So, you know, there's something at the base of that. There's a very clear concept about who you think gets to do it. And we also had 16 and 17-year-olds without a referendum on it.
On that topic, would you take the same stance in terms of, one, whether 16-year-olds should vote, and two, is there an issue in relation to a Northern Ireland vote about diaspora? I mean, how do we define who gets to vote in such a...
It's very messy. I think it becomes very messy if you start messing about.
You think you've got to be on the electoral register here?
Yes, I think so. I think if you're going to define the future of a country, I think you need to have some sort of buy-in. You can't be just a fly in and fly out type of citizen. If you are going to buy into the future of the country, I think it needs to be people that are here who are going to then have the consequences of whatever plays out of that.
And 16 or 18?
18.
16. But also, I
wonder why. There's a difference there.
I fundamentally think 18, because that's as a society, we have agreed 18.
But we do know what the cohorts are in terms of younger people and the sort of balance in the community.
That is, if you look at younger cohorts, by and large, they don't vote in huge numbers. Even when they are energetic, they don't vote in huge numbers. So I don't think it's as clear-cut as you think in terms of that younger cohort, because if you look at the census and look at the identities that are in with those cohorts, it's not as clear-cut, oh, it's overwhelming one side. It's not. I think that 16, I think, is too young. I think 18 is a settled age that we as a society believe in as adulthood, and that's where I think it should sit.
Well, I don't think we should underestimate the capacity of 16 and 17-year-olds to engage in political processes. It's not about their identity or their religious background or which way they might vote. I am a keen supporter in expanding the franchise. I think it strengthens democracy, it richens the debate. I take issue with this idea of fly in, fly out, people who are not active citizens. Lots of people who do not live in their home place are still keenly active citizens.
That raises the question then, how would you define the electorate for a board poll within Northern Ireland?
I think it's a debate that does have to happen. I think it's notable that a lot of countries do provide. I mean, I think it's something that needs to be debated.
Apart from debate, what would be the actual position? Do you think should be accepted on?
I'm not going to give my opinion on that yet, but I want to make the point. I want to make the point that lots of countries provide this, and I want to make the point about the UK. So yes, it's correct that lots of people were excluded from the Brexit referendum, including those who might have been living in the United Kingdom for decades. And I think there's a debate here as well that we need to have a conversation about people who are normally resident, who this is their home, and then I also think that there needs to be that conversation around citizens who are living outside of the island of Ireland. In the context of the United Kingdom, people who have been living in Spain for 30 years can vote for their MP, and that MP can actually create legislation and have an active role in changing the laws of the United Kingdom. So I think when you see 125 countries providing some means for citizens living outside of that place to be able to have an active role in the shaping of that country, we should be able to be mature enough to consider that actually that might be something valuable for us to consider in our own future, and that people, because they have moved to Australia or New Zealand or America, does not mean that they care any less about the future of their home place, and they should have a place in that conversation.
We've got another question here in the front row.
My name's Bridie McElhill. I live in North Down, so you can put those two things together. A couple of things. I remember during COVID, there was an online talk from the School of Irish Studies at Queen's, and it was Professor Fergal Cochrane, and I asked him what was the public's view in England about holding on to Northern Ireland, and he said that surveys had indicated that if Northern Ireland wanted to kind of self-determine its own future, well, then that was fine. But that was not the same view about Scotland. They were going to fight to keep Scotland, but they weren't going to put the same effort into holding on to Northern Ireland. That was the public. So I wonder, would the British government fight, to hold on to Northern Ireland, mirroring that? I don't know. Secondly, that I remember, I do open water swimming, and I'm surrounded by, I have I have friends who do swimming, but they would be of a unionist persuasion. And at Brexit, we had a lot of conversation about a border poll. It was really good. It was really interesting, and some views were kind of set
In the water at the time.
We
no?
do.
Yeah.
In the water, we talk about food and what to watch on the television. This was we talk away, and we're great crack. But anyway, this was actually on the slip before we went in, and there were people who say, I would always vote. I'm pro-union, and that's fine. And others were up for discussion, and I was curious about this. And I thought, oh, so there's possibilities here, and we're aware of these three groups that Aaron talks about. Those that are who are not going to, the two big groups who are pro-union and pro are not going to be the deciders of the outcome. It's going to be the persuadables, and of which I am one. And I'm kind of curious. I am curious, Aaron, as to what is the argument for staying in the union, because my decision.
Now, the problem is we're getting close to having a United Ireland UK thing, which we could do briefly, but we will have had that many times before, and we could go for a long time. So which question do you want to go for?
Well, I can answer it for Aaron if you want.
Well, no, my question is actually if I vote for pro-union, it is not for the status quo of Northern Ireland, because they talk about the shared Ireland as being what people will likely vote for, whereas I'm interested in a shared Northern Ireland. And would that be on the table? And what would that look like to unionists? Because I know what it might involve for me.
You don't think we've got a shared Northern Ireland as things stand, yeah?
Sorry?
You don't think we've got a shared Northern Ireland
No.
as things stand, yeah? Mm-hmm.
No.
Well, look, there's quite a lot in there to decode. Let's take another question. Sorry, I didn't realise you were
Okay,
yeah.
just a quick, first of all, fantastic conversation, really, really interesting. But my question, Quintin, I'd be interested, historically, who sets the question? Where does that power lie? And for Emma and Aaron, how should that question be set in the border poll, Ireland question?
So can we bear in mind what we've already heard from Bridie and then just try and take both of those together, maybe starting with Quintin? I don't know.
Yeah, the question is very important, but the question is also unimportant, which is a contradiction. So the Good Friday question was stupid. It was, do you agree with the agreement reached at Stormont House talks on command paper 6443? Absolutely stupid question. But everyone got a copy of the agreement sent to them, and everyone knew what they were voting for. It was post-conflict. Will we go for it with all its bad pills to swallow, or will we stick out for more or go for status quo? The Kurdistan question I mentioned was also silly. So the question is usually formed by the government or the authority. In the UK system, it has to go through the Electoral Commission, which is an independent but government-appointed quango. In the south, through the Referendum Commission, and is now deemed to be very important. Like the Scottish question, I didn't quite like, do you want Scotland to be a separate country? Because I think it is a separate country in a lot of ways.
It wasn't separate.
Sorry, independent. My focus was on the country word, because I think it is already a separate, an independent, a country. Yes, sorry. So the question is sometimes important. And that's where the confusion can creep in, which is why it's really key to get the terms of the debate, the proto-agreement that you have, unlike in Australia where they didn't know what would replace the Queen, settled beforehand, or at least a mechanism to deal with it after. Now, in the border poll question, one presumes that it would be agreed between the Irish and British governments, although that's not specified. And one presumes that there would be the same question, but in '98 it was different questions. because in the south they were changing Articles 2 and 3 that was included in the question, and in the north it was command paper, which wasn't referred to in the south. So
the question is almost implicit in the legislation that was passed in 1998, isn't it? Because there's a phrase there, if the wish expressed by a majority in such a poll is that Northern Ireland should cease to be part of the United Kingdom and form part of a united Ireland. So the question is probably going to be something along the lines of, do you agree that Northern Ireland should cease to be part of the United Kingdom and form part of a united Ireland? It won't be, saying that there's a lot of other possible options in terms of the two islands coming together or a new Commonwealth or what have you. It'll probably be along those lines, yeah.
And what a relief to have the question already figured out in advance with the agreement, hopefully. But I just want to pick up, I think, on Bridie's point. So, because as Quintin has so eloquently already covered, the question is important and also not important at the same time. I think timing is very important for any referendum, and timing is often dictated by the societal landscape, where society is, what's important to society, and also politically how it's going to work for political parties and what they're willing to accept. So all those things kind of combine to whether or not it's going to be the time for it. Obviously, we have no ability of setting the timelines, and that makes those of us who would like to see a very carefully planned agreement in advance a bit nervous about not having an idea of how long there might be to be able to create that plan. But on the points of a united Northern Ireland, united Ireland, the whole debate around constitutional futures, I would be surprised if the pro-Remain in the UK position was going to be trying to create a hopeful vision of something different. I think it will probably rely quite heavily on the status quo. Relying on defence and health, I think, will be two really big parts of that, defence and security. I think they will perhaps find comfort in the fact that people are typically risk adverse. So, and we know that from other referendums, can be kind of difficult to pass an ambitious new vision of something else. And when it comes down to it, people will get nervous about their pensions and about their jobs and all the other little bits and pieces. But I think Brexit is an example of how sometimes there can be a shift, right? So Brexit is a bit of an outlier in the sense that, people didn't know what was going to happen when they voted for Brexit. And a risk-adverse society, you would have probably thought they were going to end up voting no, right? And they didn't. And there's a lot of reasons why that happened. Lots of fault with the Remain camp in terms of the vision they put out and the campaigning they did. But and lots of things that the Leave campaign did well. People were worried about remaining in the EU. So actually, in a way, the Leave campaign managed to make it seem just as risky to remain as part of the European Union. But they were tapping into zeitgeist within society, people who felt disenfranchised, people who felt left behind, people who were socioeconomically deprived, who didn't feel they were thriving, who felt like their society was limited. And that was part of the reason why they were able to get people, I think, to shift their vote. In the context of a border pool referendum here, a lot of people have been left behind in Northern Ireland. There are lots of areas here who are still socioeconomically deprived, who haven't felt the peace dividend, who haven't felt like they have been able to thrive. And I think that might actually see a different shift in the idea of how risk-adverse people in Northern Ireland will be. Maybe people will be more inclined to think, this vision of a hopeful future that is different from what I currently have, I might be willing to take that risk because it's better than the status quo. So I think there'll be an interesting dynamic whichever way it goes, but I think that it'll be easier for the pro-United Ireland camp, especially with the context of the European Union too, because for a lot of people, the debate has shifted. It will not necessarily be about the romantic notion of a United Ireland. It'll actually be about returning to the European Union, and that will actually make it much easier to make that case.
Finally, Aaron, I can maybe get you to address particularly Bridie's points, which boil down seem to be that across the UK as a whole, there wasn't so much commitment to Northern Ireland as there maybe was to keeping Scotland within the fold. And also that Bridie felt that the kind of Northern Ireland on offer right now doesn't necessarily cater to those who are maybe persuadable either way.
Yeah, well, I know there was the question over here and then this one. So the question where I think it will come down, the Belfast Agreement, there's that line, and Mark points it out, but I think it will be a negotiation between probably the British and Irish government openly about what that question would be. And therein lies the problem with referendums, because often they're very binary. And what Emma talks about, we'll have a discussion, we'll have a chat about this, and this could be an option. I don't think that will be what's on the table, essentially, and that's probably a challenge with referendums. Then just on the point of looking around Northern Ireland, I would say it's like any country, it's a work in progress. I think we're a lot better as a country now than we were 30, 40 years ago. That's not taken away from the challenges of what's at hand in Northern Ireland and how we need to advance as a country. What I would say is, and I'll point out, that if you go to, and I have family members over in Donegal, they've said the same about Dublin and how they care about Donegal. I have family in Liverpool. If I go to them, if you ask them to vote tomorrow, would they want to stay in England? A lot of them would vote to leave England. So this idea that somehow one part of a country, because it feels a certain way about another part of the country, is going to dictate the whole future of Northern Ireland for the United Kingdom, I think is inherently wrong. I think it's up for us here in Northern Ireland to make Northern Ireland the best possible place it can be. And that's not taken away from the challenges we have at hand, because they are many. It's the same right across the whole of Europe at this point in time. If you go to any country in the world, we're not unique in the challenges we face. Now, in terms of differences and how we manage them, I think that's the vital thing that we should be focusing on in the future. And I think, and this is where I think is a bit of a challenge for Ireland's future. And they always talk about, what our future United Ireland's going to look. It's always, we'll go and have a conversation about it, we'll have a discussion, we'll have a debate, but they'll never firmly say, this is what it's going to look like, this is what it's going to be. And I think that is an inherent problem within that discussion, essentially. I feel that Northern Ireland, though it's imperfect in many ways, can do a lot to bring communities together and can build on that and build a better Northern Ireland for everybody within the context of the United Kingdom, because I think that gives us a unique strength and a unique point that no other country can really point to.
I think that's brought us to the end of time quite nicely. We're about to be evicted from the room. So next time that we hold this event, Bridie will be in the chair and we will all have our swimming costumes on and be discussing this somewhere off the North Down coast. But thank you very much for everybody for your questions, and thank you very much to our panellists for coming at this from many, many angles. And for Quintin, Emma and Aaron, can I ask for a final round of applause?